well, and was trying to bring them all together by really looking back and saying, have we got anything new to say about this? What I'm going to talk about today is something slightly different. It's one aspect of the story is about the kind of research that has gone on into answering this question about sex differences in the brain. And Pavla mentioned the term gender blind research. And actually what I'm going to be showing in the next 40 minutes or so is that actually the research that's gone into answering this question isn't gender blind, and that has been a problem. So this is focusing on how a particular way of looking at data, way of collecting data, way of doing research can be biased in a particular way. It can distort the research, can even damage the kind of research that's being done. So to move on, I'll just present my credentials. As was mentioned, I'm a neuroscientist, so my day job involves using sort of state-of-the-art brain imaging techniques which we have in the Aston Brain Centre at Aston University. I'm actually very interested in developmental disorders. So a lot of my work is focused on looking at young children and adolescents on the autistic spectrum. So I'm really interested in how brains get to be different. So I work at the sort of technological end, and we look at research methodology and ways of asking those sort of questions. So the idea of the book didn't really start about looking at the sex differences in the brain. It was about, let's find out how brains get to be different. But the fundamental issue in brain research is that there is a difference between male and female brains. There is such a thing as male and female brain, and a lot of brain imaging research and effort has gone into investigating that question. So that's what I started to look at, and that's when I realized that there are some fairly fundamental flaws in a lot of this research, and we need to look at those very carefully, because it's very, very important research. I'm not, and I should say this from the beginning, a sex difference denier, as I have been accused of being, a bit like a climate change denier, with in the same tone, with the same consequences for civilization. Definitely there are biological sex differences in the brain. It's what those mean, and how we interpret them, and how we then use that research, because that's the key issue. This is not just an anatomical exercise looking for differences in the brain. It's finding differences in the brain in order to explain gender gaps in society, for example. So I use the techniques such as EEG, oldest one of all, although now sort of updated, also fMRI, with which people are familiar, and also a more unusual technique, which was sort of unique to Aston at the beginning, although there are a few more now in the UK, and that's looking at the magnetic fields associated with brain activity. So we have all of these techniques at our fingertips, as have any brain imaging labs. And it's really looking, today I'm going to be talking about how those techniques are used, and what questions are being asked in this particular forum. So moving on, this is really what I think I'm going to be talking about, the idea that the notion of gender stereotypes, the belief that there are particular differences, can have quite profound effects on fundamental research. It can distort research itself. So we need to find out, what questions are we asking? If we bring a particular belief to our research forum, how can that affect that forum? Belief in gender stereotypes can actually distort the message, because you present your data, you communicate your research in particular terms in order to address the particular issues which have in fact informed that research. And so you need to understand the terminology that's used and how that might be biased. But you also need to understand what is being heard, because you're talking to people who, all of whom have brains, and all of whom have a gender of some kind. So they're very interested in those particular issues. But there may be all sorts of problems, such as confirmation bias, where you hear what you want to hear, or you hear what you already believe. And scientists have to bear that in mind when they're communicating their research. And it can also, and this is very much a hobby of mine, it can distort the research environment. There's huge gender gaps in science. Women are vastly underrepresented in many fields in science. And that is an issue for the science environment itself, but also, again, for the sort of questions that are asked and who's addressing the data. So you get this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So those are the kind of three areas that I'll be looking at. Just to remind you briefly, the kind of historical context, the idea that there were differences between, or that male and female brains might be different, didn't used to be a question. It was a given. Right at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, when brain science was emerging as a way of understanding human behavior, human society, etc. The then scientists didn't have access to the brain. So this is an important thing to remember. You don't have access to an intact living human brain and an intact living human. You could see what happened with certain sorts of disease or damage, or you could look at dead brains and make inferences. That's important to remember, because it's something which changed when brain imaging arrived, but not necessarily, the whole narrative didn't necessarily change along with it. So I called it the Hunt the Differences agenda, because the then neuroscientists looked, if you like, they looked at the society status quo. They said, let's have a look at society, how it's stratified, how it's organized. Women are clearly inferior because they didn't have access to education, finance, political power, etc. So what they said was, we need to prove, find out why their brains are inferior. So the assumption was that women had inferior brains, and I use that term advisedly. And one, Gustave Le Bon, women represent the most inferior forms of human evolution and are closer to children and savages than to an adult civilized man. So bear in mind that these were the neuroscientists, or the scientists not called neuroscientists at the time. These were the scientists who were devising the research, who were making conclusions. Clearly not an objective viewpoint. And even so, later on, you could say, well, that was, right at the beginning of this kind of story. But in 1965, we find a psychologist saying we must start with the realization that as much as women want to be good scientists and engineers, they want first and foremost to be womanly companions of men and to be good mothers. So the scientists researching this question clearly had a clear view as to the answer they were finding. They were going to say, we're going to find inferior brains, or we're going to find brains which are in some way configured to make women want to be womanly companions, men, etc. So important to bear that in mind. The other aspect is the kind of measures that are used in order to investigate these questions. And so we get the very original way, which was taking empty skulls, filling them with birdseed or buckshot, and weighing how much went into the skull and drawing conclusions about size of the brain from the amount of birdseed it took to fill the skull. A big excitement at the beginning, because it was found that on average, and that's important, we'll come back to that, men's brains were about 5 ounces heavier than women's, and therefore they thought, we found the conclusion, sex matters, it's a size matters issue, and therefore men are cleverer, superior, because they've got bigger brains. And then somebody said it can't just be size, because sperm whales and elephants have got bigger brains than human men, and they're not generally renowned for being more intelligent. So then different sort of metrics were devised, ratios of brain size to body weight, etc., etc. Very other strange techniques, again, bearing in mind we couldn't really look at the brain. Phrenology, feeling the bumps on the surface of the skull and drawing conclusions about what the brain was like underneath, and attributing different size bumps to different size skills and propensities and personalities. Very strange technique called craniology, which was agonizingly detailed in looking at the angle of the forehead as a function of the length of the chin or the size of the earlobe, etc. Really, really intricate, tiny measures. I mean, one particular craniology paper had more than 500 measures, and all of those were put together and said, this tells us what the brain was like. The key thing to realize is that these metrics were used in order to generate a hierarchy, a scale of this is the best at the top and this is the worst at the bottom. But the hierarchy was predetermined. So the idea was that however these measures were used, the top of the scale should be white, because it also intersected with race science, male, upper class, class came into it too, educated males. And then a bit further down, white women and children, a bit further down, lower classes, and a bit further down, probably at the bottom, other races. So, and if any of these metrics didn't come up with that particular hierarchy, they were dropped. So there was never any issue about, well, there must be something wrong with the question if we haven't come up with the right answer. The metrics used to come up with that answer were dropped if they didn't come up with the right answer. So that, in a way, and of course, I'm not saying anything like as extreme is going on today, but we will see that there is an issue with respect to that. So if you don't come up with the answer you expect, then you think there must be something wrong with the research or the measure you were using. So worth bearing that in mind. Okay. So once they'd established, this kind of form of research, then it went on. It became very popular. Lots of different ways of looking at the brains. Experimental psychologists joined in and produced this nice long list of personality characteristics or skills or whatever that differentiated males and females. Beginning of the last century, 1910, description of the field as it then was, there is perhaps no field aspiring to be scientific where flagrant personal bias, logic martyred in the cause of supporting a prejudice, unfounded assertions, and even sentimental rot and drivel have run riot to such an extent as here. They're not a ringing endorsement of the relationship between brain and behavior at that stage. And you might say, again, this is early years of this kind of research. There was clear political bias because it was entangled with the whole issue of women wanting access to education and political power, etc. So the pressure was on science to come up with the kind of answers that, you shouldn't expose women to education. Or, hormonally, they were certainly unsuited to any kind of political power. So again, but worth bearing in mind that there is a kind of political bias here. But later on, 100 years later, in fact, Cordelia Fine summarizing the area, when we follow the trail of contemporary science, we discover a surprising number of gaps, assumptions, inconsistencies, poor methodologies, and leaps of faith, as well as more than one echo of the insalubrious past. So 100 years have gone by and there's still a lot of problem in this area. So we must move on and have a look and see where these problems lie and where they're taking us and how we might deal with them. So this is a kind of rather complicated infographic, which is actually showing the perspective which informed this research and carried on informing the research. And it's really only just starting to change. And that is what we call the essentialist perspective. And that term essential is interesting in itself. It actually means biological essence. So there is some kind of idea that whatever it is that makes you a male or a female gives you a whole list of other characteristics which you'll go into. But the term essential in itself probably carries a different meaning for different people. If somebody said to you, what do you think essential means? You'd probably say, well, really important, something we must really have. And this, again, informed a lot of how the work was viewed and interpreted, that it was some kind of natural process, which, and then the next stage would be, shouldn't be interfered with. But at this point, the idea was that we were looking at some kind of fixed, inevitable and invariant process. Male and female brains arrived in the world already different. Whatever it was that determined females had one kind of anatomy and males had another kind of anatomy, and this was before obviously the idea of genotypes, etc., also determined the fact that they had a different brain. And this was a statement, no measures at that point had been taken. So females had a female brain, males had a male brain. If you had a male brain, then that you arrived in the world with a certain number of nascent skills, which would then be well established via education, and then you'd reach a developmental endpoint, your brain stopped growing, but you had all the skills and personality necessary to be an achiever, political leader, winner of the Nobel Prize, etc. Females, slightly different story. They arrived in the world possibly without some of these skills. Early on, as I mentioned, in the 19th century, they didn't have the access to education, which might have allowed them to acquire those skills. And there was a very strong feeling that actually it was dangerous to expose women's brains and reproductive systems to higher education. And there was a condition called anorexia scholastica, which was going to take women off if you expose them to higher education. So a very profound belief. And again, an indication of how this belief informed policy. But these brains again arrived at a developmental endpoint fixed. This is what they were going to be like. And they were much more likely to be emotionally labile, etc. But the characteristics associated with the owner of those brains were very different. So two very different types of brains. And associated with that is again this idea that if you had one particular kind of brain, you had a particular set of skills. if you had a lady brain, that you were very good at empathy and emotion and understanding language, but you were rubbish at reading maps, for example. Whereas if you had a manly brain, you were very good at science thinking, you were very good at being assertive, being a leader, lots of self-confidence, but you were rubbish at understanding emotions and listening, etc. And another consequence of that was if you had that portfolio, then you had a particular place in society. So this is really, if you like, how sex got to be gender. So bearing in mind that early on, gender wasn't a separate term. It was assumed that they were talked about sex roles, sex differences in behavior. You talked about sex differences in personality, in psychology. You talked about sex roles in behavior. So we didn't have the term gender. So again, that language gives the idea that the belief in biology, this essential belief in biology. So that's important to bear in mind, so that this was the driving force behind all sorts of policy decisions, because again, it was assumed that if this was the case, then this was the end point that you were aiming females for, or this was the end point that you were aiming males for, etc. So that was the particular perspective. And I think this is nicely characterized by a book which came out just at the beginning of this century, which was called The Essential Difference, so that term essential again. And the opening lines of that book are by Simon Baron-Cohen, and it is actually very interesting. I'll come back to that shortly. The female brain is hardwired for empathy. So the female brain, there is a separate organ, which is female, hardwired, and that's really important. So it's fixed, you can't change it, for empathy. So bought into this idea that there's a set of skills. The male brain is hardwired for understanding systems. And so again, you've got this language which certainly talks about female and male, differentiates brains on the basis of sex. Actually, later on in the book, he then goes on to say, of course, you don't have to be a female to have a female brain. You don't have to be a male to have a male brain. And I challenged him on this several times over the last few years and in the book last year, and said, if you don't have to be a male to have a male brain, why are you calling it a male brain? Because that communicates all sorts of different meanings to people who are possibly not trained as neuroscientists or appreciate the nuance of scientific language, etc. And just this week, he came out with a public retraction and said, perhaps it is time to dial back on the language of male and female brains. So, a bit of a success story there. We'll come back to that anyway. But I think these kind of thinking informs a lot of not only public belief in male and female brains, but also informs science, as we shall see. So I should move on. Okay, so we come back to this idea that this particular line of thinking can distort the research in terms of what questions we're asking. So we'll come to that bit first. I'd mentioned the fact that we couldn't, up till the end of the 1990s really, actually have access to intact living human brains. We had an understanding neuropsychologists worked back from saying, what particular patterns of behavior emerge if somebody has a brain injury or suffers a degenerative disease, etc. But we really didn't have a good idea of how the brain worked in individuals, healthy individuals carrying out standard array of tasks, even if they're in the scanner. So once brain imaging arrived, and these were the kind of techniques that the images that I showed a bit earlier that can be generated by the techniques I used. And it gave this amazing impression that at last, the invisible has been made visible, because people were acknowledging the fact that all of the brain theories were based on inferences. Now they thought, fantastic, we can really, really look at the brain. And these images gave us the impression that we could look at the brain. And there was this kind of feeling that there was a kind of real-time window on the brain. And there's also the language attached to that. So this is, for example, an image from my lab, which is about looking at familiar or unfamiliar faces. And what you actually do is you get a structural image and you generate a pattern of activation associated with a particular task. I'll come back to that. And you superimpose it on the structural image. And it looks like, and the language that people use, the brain lights up when it sees a familiar face, or the brain lights up here when it sees a new face. And you can then look at those patterns of activation. And there's all sorts of other ways of illustrating this. One of the key issues is that you could have said, okay, we've now got access to the real-time brain activity. It looks like real-time brain activity. Let's take a blank slate. If we're interested in individual differences in the brain. Let's actually examine the brain in detail, compare them in different people with different tasks, etc. But actually what happened right from the beginning, the hunt the differences agenda continued in sex differences research. It informed the idea that there was a difference and that science had to find that difference. It didn't go the other way around and say, let's see if there's a difference. And one of the ways that was bought into, if you like, was all these images are actually images of differences. So these aren't patterns of real-time activity in a single brain. They're group averages. And they're actually an image of the difference between a group of people doing a baseline task, such as lying, listening to some words, and the same group of people listening to the words and having to translate them to a different language or remember them. And then you take one set of information from the other, and that reveals possibly a tiny, tiny difference. And it is so tiny that you have to threshold the data because our brains are active all the time. Our brains don't look like this when we're looking at familiar faces, nothing much going on there and a nice burst of activity here. Our brains are hugely active. There may be tiny, tiny differences, and the tinyness I'll come back to. So you really need to manipulate the images. And this is, perfectly valid statistical manipulation and image manipulation, etc. But the impression you give is of these really marked characteristic differences. And these kind of images, as we will see, became they're very compelling, but they were misleading. And so a lot of people said, well, look, fantastic. We've got groups of men, with groups of women, we're giving these people a task, and look at the huge differences between them. Differences are actually very tiny. And this image here is quite a nice example. Before this kind of brain imaging arrived, there was really a very well-established idea that women were much better at verbal tasks than men. And there was speculation that this was to do with the representation of language on the brain. So one of the very, very first studies that brain imaging used was, let's have a look and see how males and females process language. And so they took very small, because at that point, it was difficult to do these kind of tasks. And so you had very small cohorts of individuals. So I think there was 19 males, 19 females. They gave them 4 different language tasks. And they reported on the one language task, which did show a difference. The others didn't. And again, we'll come back to that as an interesting observation. There was one particular task, a rhyming task, where they said, well, we'll average together all the data from the males, we'll average together all the data from the females, and we'll have a look and see. And what they came up with is, again, very compelling image, which looked as though, oh, look, males process language just on one side of the brain, and the way it was configured in the early days was this was actually the left hemisphere, whereas females process language on both sides. Fantastic. This has given us proof of all the thinking we have about language. If you actually look at the data, in particular the data about females, they said there were, there were 4 tasks and only one showed a difference. In the females, there was 19 females, 11 of them showed exactly the same pattern as males. 11 showed this pattern and the rest showed the same pattern or no difference as males. So effectively, although this was reported as showing more than half of the females showed this activation pattern, actually only less than half didn't. Yet this image is very compelling and it's still being used today. And that's another issue about these kind of findings. They have this fantastic stickability. So this study has been debunked so many times in neuroscience literature, and people have done big meta-analyses of similar studies saying we haven't found this distinction. And yet this is something which still informs schools as to how girls should be educated differently from boys. Huge numbers. And I found it, in fact, on Stanford University's website just recently as illustrating issues of single sex education, etc. So again, Cordelia Fine comes up with a nice summary and saying that actually what's happening with this new technique is that people are still looking for sex differences in the brain, are still claiming that they're extensive, big differences like these, functionally significant. So actually saying, we're actually looking at structures, but we're telling you that this means how people do language or memory or whatever. And they're fixed. So the assumption is that whenever you looked at males or females, this is the kind of difference that you would find. And so we were still fixed into this idea that research is demonstrating this kind of essentialist pathway, even though it wasn't. So the images themselves are lending themselves to finding differences. The interpretation of the data, and in fact, even the research questions being asked, are assuming there is still a difference, and that's what we want to report. So not quite as bad as craniology, etc., but it is still being informed in that particular way. Now, if we actually look at, we step back and say, okay, so last 30 years, we've had access to brain imaging techniques, and whether or not we like it, one of the key drivers of research is that there are sex differences in the brain, and that's what lots and lots of studies have been done. So you might say, well, let's have a look and see what kind of conclusions have been drawn. And you might come up with, this is an example, sex differences in the adult human brain, evidence from over 5,000 participants, etc. Still looking at structures at the moment, and I think, again, that's something worth bearing in mind. And you think, if you actually did a quick, I don't know, Google Scholar or some kind of survey like that, you would come up with thousands of papers reporting sex differences. And you'll say, oh, well, fantastic, clearly there are sex differences because there's thousands of papers that have been looking for these and thousands of papers that find them. And if, it's fine if you're a neuroscientist and you can start to look at the details more, but if you were a journalist or an interested party or somebody writing an article about sex differences for whatever, they might say, I think it might be brain-based, let's have a look at the brain literature. Oh, look, thousands. And it's not until you really go into the data, the details of these data, that you realize, yes, they've found sex differences, but actually they're sex differences in different parts of the brain. And a different paper will report a different difference. So this particular paper, for example, came up with the finding that the amygdala and the hippocampus, two particular structures in the brain, was different between males and females. And the term different is, again, something we'll come back to. And yet somebody did a big meta-analysis where you get together all the studies, reliable studies, which have reported such differences and seen how consistent the finding is. Somebody last year did a meta-analysis of findings about the amygdala and the hippocampus and said, there is no consistent finding that these are different. And yet people are still citing a study like that and saying, this is why men are like this and women are like that, etc. So you get this impression, which feeds into a kind of confirmation bias anyway, that there are sex differences in the brain. And it's not until you really stop and you say, how consistent are these? Or actually, are they the same sex differences? Because the key issue is, of course, if you believe there are sex differences, if you believe there is such a thing as the male and the female brain, you want to know what characterizes one sort of brain as opposed to the other sort of brain. But it has to be said that in spite of thousands and thousands of research papers, there is no one consistent structure, pattern of pathways, network of structures, which could reliably and infallibly distinguish the brain from a man from the brain from a woman. I can't, as a neuroscientist, look at a brain image and say, oh, right, that's a female doing X or a male doing Y or whatever. And I can't take a male or a female into my lab and predict accurately what their brain is going to look like. And I think that's a really important message. And it's not a message that we actually receive by just a glimpse of the research canon, if you like. The other aspect, of course, is the whole issue of how the difference to gender biases what actually gets published. Because if you believe that there is a difference in the brain, and you carry out a complicated, because they are labor intensive, equipment intensive, money intensive tasks. You carry out a survey. It's getting better now because there are huge databases being formed from all different sorts of labs. You do a task or whatever, you don't find a difference. You think, I must have done something wrong, and you don't publish that paper. Or you submit it for publication and the reviewers think, well, if they haven't found something, then there must be something wrong. And there again is an evidence of how what you believe has weighted or biased what actually gets reported. And I think that's really important. And both within these kind of papers, which do get published if they have just one study, and we'll come back to that, you'll find that significant finding. They've done lots and lots of comparisons, but they only report the one that was significant, which is a bit like the very early language one I mentioned. But it means that, you know, below the surface, and this is also called the file drawer problem because it doesn't get submitted for research, there are huge numbers of studies, even the ones that are published, which actually say, you know, there aren't any differences between male and female brains. We haven't been able to find any. And you think, you know, if this had been like a clinical trial for the vaccines we're talking about now, if, you know, 1% of the differences you looked for, or the cure that you'd looked for, if whatever vaccine you were testing only came up with, say, 1 or 2% significant differences, you certainly wouldn't use it. And yet these data are being used to support the idea that there are significant findings. The other aspect I would say is that we're still not quite like craniology and phrenology, but these are all still about sizes. They're all still about looking at little structures in the brain in immensely differentiated ways and seeing if we can, well, maybe if it's not the length of the corpus callosum, maybe it's the thickness of it, or maybe there's a particular part of it. And neuroscientists should acknowledge to the people who are interested, which is just about everybody, that we're not that good at actually predicting what the size of a structure means in terms of the function, the behavioral function you're interested in. Because as I said, this isn't an anatomical exercise. It's actually people interested in how these brains might support whatever pattern of behavior or skill or pathology, mental or physical, that you're interested in. So we need to bear that in mind as well. Looking at time, I must move on. Okay, so we've talked about, again, hunt the difference, and we've talked about the idea that these differences are. I've already touched on the idea that we're actually looking at very tiny differences, so that in brain imaging data, we have to magnify and threshold any differences we find in order to illustrate. But the issue of the size of the differences is true of any kind of sex differences research, whether it's behavior or whether it's brain characteristics. And that is that if you take data from two groups of people, male and female, on any particular aspect of brain or behavior you're interested in, you'll get classic distribution, which shows quite a lot of variability. You'll get an average where most people cluster around the mean, but there is variance within it. Male and female data, if you put it on a single axis, it may be, and this is height example, it may be they are fairly distinct. It's distinctive enough to say, yes, there is a difference between males and females. Quite a big difference. Still an overlap. So there are obviously some women who are taller than some men, and some women are smaller. But you would say, yeah, okay, I'll accept that as distinct. And yet, if you look at characteristic differences in sex differences or brain size, these are the kind of data overlaps we get. So we're actually focusing on very, very tiny differences here, completely ignoring the variability within the populations, which are supposedly biologically homogeneous, being male or female. I haven't even touched on the kind of whole binary aspect of the story. You would say these differences aren't very meaningful. I couldn't tell at the individual level. I couldn't predict how somebody would score on a map reading task. I couldn't predict what somebody's amygdala would look like if these are the kind of data that we're looking at. And yet it's very rare. It's only just recently that in the brain imaging literature, scientists have been told to report the effect size. So you can report a statistical difference in average, and you could say, yes, we found a difference. And if you've got a big data set, and some of these brain imaging data sets are now over, you know, in the thousands, you might well find a tiny difference. But if the data are overlapping like that, it's not really a very meaningful difference. So you need to report the effect size, you know, how much overlap is there effectively. And this is an example of a particular paper, and it's a new way of collecting huge amounts of data, and then people can go and interrogate those data sets, ask what questions they like. One of the other problems with sex difference research is that it's actually a very easy question to ask, because, you know, you've got people who've got particular characteristics, you know, you've got your participant data, and it's easy enough to say, oh, well, let's also ask and see, you know, whatever the original question was, let's see if there's sex differences. And almost invariably, if you've got a very varied population like that, you may find a difference. But if you've got a huge number, the difference will be tiny. And this was a paper 3 or 4 years ago now, which talked about looking at huge data sets and confirming that there were sex-related variations. And this was a particular characteristic of some fMRI data. But if you actually looked at how those data overlapped, you can see they're hugely overlapping. So the idea that these might be meaningful in terms of kind of functional information is very questionable. Okay, again, I must move on. How fixed are the differences? Because the idea you remember is that brains reached a fixed endpoint. They were either male or female, and they had these particular characteristics. And certainly up to the last 30 years, it was believed that once brains stopped growing, they didn't change in any way. And there were various mantra, you know, you've got the adult, you're born with the adult number of neurons, they don't get replaced, etc. All of those have changed. But the issue that brain imaging has revealed is that actually our brains change throughout our lives, up to old age, and even then, as a function of the experiences that we have. The classic example given here is of taxi cab drivers in London who have to undergo an immensely complicated visuospatial memory task. They have to remember the 20,000 routes within 6 miles of Charing Cross, to the extent that anybody can get in a black cab anywhere in London and ask to go somewhere else, and the black cab driver will instantly know how the best way to get them there, avoiding demonstrations or roadworks, etc. It takes about 3 or 4 years on average, much longer for some people, and lots of people don't manage to do it. So a very specialist group, but a very interesting group to look at to show how brains change. So a whole range of studies looked at taxi drivers before they learned the knowledge, once they'd acquired the knowledge and were working as taxi drivers, and interestingly, once they'd retired. And what they found was that there was a particular set of structures in the brain and network in the brain which underpins visuospatial skills, which did change, which the patterns of activation associated with these structures enlarged as they acquired the knowledge. But interestingly, that disappeared once they retired. So the idea is the experiences we have will change our brains. And that's important to remember, because it means if different groups of people have different experiences, maybe as a function of their gender, but maybe as a function of whatever opportunities their world offered them, that's what you could be looking at. So we're not looking at something fixed. So the people who troop into your lab to carry out your language task may have had all sorts of different experiences, and any differences you found between them, if you only looked in terms of whether they're male or female, may be masking all sorts of other differences. And these are other studies which demonstrate the plasticity of the human brain. The other thing is that our brain doesn't always solve the problem the same way. One thing we do know is that the brain kind of monitors external attitudes and expectations much more than we realize. And that's a whole other story, a whole other talk about the fact that we're social, that we pay attention to the expectations, to the attitudes in which a task is presented. So you could say to one group of individuals, this is a task that people like you are really good at. I want to see what it, how your brain processes the information. Or you could say, this is a task that people like you aren't really good at, but I want to see what happens when you do the task and process the information. You can give the same task to 2 different groups of people with negative, positive message. And you can see the way in which that will change how the brain works. So it's not just the experience, it's also a kind of social aura, if you like, which will determine the way in which brains function, which of course is the data that we brain images are collecting. And so if you present somebody with a gendered task, such as a language task or filling in an empathy questionnaire, then you're likely to find differences, but it may be the expectations that the people you're scanning have of how they should perform. Or you may even have overtly or even covertly or overtly set up this kind of stereotype expectation, which will change how the brain works. So that's important to realize, because all of the findings that are reported are based on the idea that they're somehow fixed, that they're somehow inevitable, that they're quite extensive. So I need to move on. Oh yes, this is a paper that I wrote with Cordelia Fine and Rebecca Gordon-Young and Lise Kaiser, which was pointing out that all of the sex differences research is based on this idea that things are fixed and inevitable and invariant. Now we know that the brain is plastic. That sort of thinking ought to be applied to sex differences research, and it isn't. And this was a kind of cry of frustration from us about 3 or 4 years ago, saying you're not coming up with the right answers if you're expecting this to be fixed. Okay, so we need to move on. I need to move on to talk about language again. And this is the idea that we've already mentioned the idea that perhaps scientists are not altogether objective in how they carry out the research. And that's not saying that they're trying to prove some kind of political agenda, but it might mean how they report what they find or what they focus on in their findings, because as I said, brain imaging data is a hugely complex data set. If you focus just on the differences because you believe there are, and that's why you did the research in the first place, you might use language which is what I've called neurohype, which is actually to do with the idea that you overstate your case. And this was a paper which received a lot of attention. It was the first paper which reported on connectivity patterns in male and female brains and proved that male and female brains are different, because they compared a whole load of different pathways in the brain, many pathways in the brain, focused on those where they found the difference. And they said that if you look at male brains, they tend to have pathways more from anterior to posterior. If you look at female brains, they tend to have connecting pathways more from left to right or right to left, etc. And illustrated it with these nice patterns. And this was reported and widely picked up in the popular press. So there was lots and lots of, at last, the truth, you know, at least you neuroscientists have caught up with what we knew all along. Men and women really are different, and here's the proof. They didn't, there was a lot of problems with these kind of studies, but the key issue is all they illustrated were the significant differences. There were many differences which weren't significant. They didn't report the effect size, and actually these were the biggest effect sizes of these differences in pathways between male and females. So tiny differences, again, hugely overlapping. So how meaningful were those? It was also interesting that they looked at a whole age range from about 10 up to about 60 or 70, and the differences didn't emerge until the sort of 20 age group upwards. So you could say these brains had been exposed to a huge amount of gendered experiences up to that age, and that's when the differences emerged. So claiming these were fundamental sex differences was really overstating the case. And a couple of examples here I won't go into in detail, but this was an amazing brain imaging study, because these images are very compelling. This was looking at functional connectivity, looking at different pathways connected with all sorts of different skills in male and female brains. And they said that sex differences in functional connectivity are prominent. These data provide novel evidence, divergent patterns of cognition seen in males and females are reflected on a neural level in differential patterns. Well, actually, the kind of data that you collect for these allow you to do huge numbers of comparisons. In this case, it was 34,716 comparisons, of which 178 were significant. And yet they talk about prominent sex differences. So be careful, you know, it's not exactly what it says on the tin. And similarly, sometimes individuals, researchers found structural differences in the brain, but reported them in terms of functional differences. So they talked about male differences underpinning their specialized facial processing, whereas female differences very good at supporting language. They didn't measure spatial processing or language in this task. They just found some structural differences and interpreted them in terms of stereotype differences. So the language is important and not always fully representative of what was actually found. And that leads to another problem, which I'll just touch on very briefly, which is because everybody's interested in this, because those images were very compelling very early on, and unfortunately it seems to have died down a bit now, we got a huge outbreak of what was called neurohype. You put neuro in front of anything and people believed it. So there was a lot of very popular self-help gurus who suddenly started publishing books on relationships between men and women, or why men don't listen and women can't read maps. Books called Brain Sex, and also talk about the good part of the brain, etc. Change your brain, change your life. The classic, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. All of these illustrated with misrepresented neuroscience findings, because these wonderful images that I talked about earlier gave the impression that this was a real-time finding and that your brain lights up. Women's brains light up on both sides when they use language, and men don't understand language because they only hear it with their left hemisphere, etc. And those are the kind of terms that we use. So, and some lovely terms associated with this: neuro bandwagons, neuro bunk, my favorite, neuro flap doodle. So there is a lot of rubbish written because of the misleading characteristic of these findings. And I rudely termed these neurotrash because that's what they were. Now, I'm drawing your attention to this because the issue is associated with the fact that there is an element of self-fulfilling prophecy in these kind of stereotypes. So that if you, as a girl or as a boy, believe you can do this, you can't do that. If you're a teacher, if you're a parent, you read books like this, there is a belief in the outside world, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you start to think, well, you know, scientists have found, and you will find references to decades of neuroscience research have proved. And people think, well, these neuroscientists know what they're doing, and it resonates with their lived experience, because you think, well, yes, my daughter is different from my son, so clearly girls are different from boys, and there's scientists out there proving it. So this kind of aura of these stereotypes is in itself a problem, because it feeds into the very problem that we're investigating. So moving on very quickly then, just to finalize, is to get on one of my particular bandwagons. This kind of stereotype can also distort the research environment. And I think this is something that quite a lot of you are involved in. It's not only the research itself, but who does that research? And this is where we come to the underrepresentation of women in science. Why are there so few women in science, and particularly in some kind of sciences like physics and computer science, which in itself is a problem, because if so much of our future science is going to be based on data scientists, artificial intelligence, deep learning systems, who feeds into the development of those systems is really important. And if the research environment isn't diverse, then that's going to cause us a real problem. So the underrepresentation of women, of ethnic minorities, of people with disabilities, etc., in science is really important. But just to focus on how this whole kind of gender stereotype thing feeds in here. The idea is that there's a nice phrase here which talks about, maybe it's to do with the fact that women in science face a glass obstacle course, that there are particular barriers which are not necessarily evident, which nevertheless impede their progress through science. And I just want to illustrate how gender stereotypes can affect that. First of all, we know that very, very young children, in fact, babies from very early on, are picking up gender clues. It's very important to develop their self-identity, to understand where they belong in the world, who are their in-group, who are their out-group, what the rules are associated with it. And we know that within very young populations, there is a belief that girls don't do science. So we've got, I'm too pretty to do maths, and I'm sure many of you will know all sorts of early examples of early stereotypes in early years in education and in books, etc., and in the representation of science, of who does science, that there is a belief from very early on that girls don't do that. And we have part of our network in the brain, our social network in the brain, is also monitoring the particular rules in the outside world, which determine what's good for you to do and what's bad for you to do, and will inhibit behavior which doesn't seem to consistent with the in-group to which you should be being associated. So right from a very early age, this stereotype is informing our behavior. You remember I also mentioned that experiences will change our brain. The experiences we have, the experiences we don't have will change our brains. So if those experiences are gendered, then that in itself may produce those differences which are claimed between male and female brains. And toys is a very, very interesting arena to look at, to understand where these early training opportunities might come from. And sometimes people, it's a bit eye-rolling, and people say it was just, political correctness about you shouldn't, differentiate. You have the whole pink and blue story, which is again another whole story. If boys want to play with Lego and girls want to play with dolls, it doesn't matter. Well, it does actually matter, because we know that in science, an ability to think spatially is really, really important for many branches of science. It's claimed as a very robust sex difference, one of the few sex differences, because a lot of the behaviors that were, the go-to list that psychologists came up with, actually, they're disappearing over time. But this is supposed to be robust. And yet big surveys of spatial cognition in males and females have found that initially, yes, males seem to do better on tasks of spatial cognition. But if you also find out what kind of spatial training opportunities individuals have had, which can include what kind of toys did you play with, what kind of video games do you play, what hobbies do you have, etc., If you get a spatial experience factor, then the sex differences disappear. So women who have lots of spatial experience for whatever reason are as good at these tasks as males. So spatial experience is really important. If the toys you play with don't afford you that, then you're already behind the curve, if you like, in entering into science. And the examples I've given here is that this is a pattern of Lego, characteristically something that's given to boys that boys play with more commonly. And people say, but surely, you know, girls are encouraged to play with sciencey toys, construction toys. But this is an example, I think, obviously I'm extreme in my example. This is Barbie the engineer, who Mattel decided was going to solve the problem of the underrepresentation of women in science. So somewhat stereotypically dressed, you may acknowledge. But what Barbie the engineer can make is a pink washing machine or a pink jewelry carousel. So you might say, yes, I do think there is a gender bias in the kind of spatial experience that we have. The other thing is attitudes. And again, this rogues gallery here, males in the 21st century, public statements about on various forums about why women don't appear in science because they didn't have the right kind of aptitude. The Google memo, Google shouldn't be wasting its time on diversity initiatives because women, for biological reasons, don't have the right kind of skills that would make them good at what Google wants. A physicist in CERN a couple of years ago saying physics shouldn't be wasting its money on training girls because there are sound scientific evidence of gender differences in interests and abilities. So again, if we know that how you solve a problem affects how your brain works, if you know that belonging to an in-group is really important, self-esteem is really important as part of, you know, a driver within the brain. We do know that anything which dents your self-esteem will inhibit behaviors associated with that loss of self-esteem and will lead to withdrawal or disengagement, etc. So if you've got that within science, then any individuals who experience that are less likely to stay. And if you've negotiated all of these, you know, not having the right, you know, not being expected to do well, not having the right experiences, confronting all kinds of attitudes, if you get into science, there's a big debate or body of data emerging demonstrating how much bias there is within science with respect to the various rewards and progresses that are made possible for women. So this is really an idea that the gender stereotypes have all sorts of effect on the research process, but they also have effects on who does that research. So this leads to what's called the gender equality paradox, which some of you may know about, which is the idea that in the most gender equal countries, surprise, surprise, there is the biggest underrepresentation of women in science. And you think Scandinavia, Iceland, etc. And there is an underlying narrative associated with that, which is very much, however hard you work to ensure gender equity, because that in the past has been claimed as the reason for the underrepresentation of women in science. If you look at countries where the gender equity gap is smallest and the term level playing field is used, then there's this big underrepresentation of women in science. And there is reference to endogenous interests, so that women, even though clearly they're capable and they have actually kindly measured that to prove it, they choose not to do science. And there is this underlying essentialist narrative still associated with this particular gender gap, if you like, science. So I think that's a really nice case study of a lot of the issues associated here. So those are the three areas that I think is important that we bear in mind: understanding what gender stereotypes can do in terms of what questions we ask, how we interpret the answers and what people hear, and also who does the research. So my concluding comment is that gendered questions produced gendered answers. Thank you very much. I think that's just about the right time, hopefully.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I get carried away and then think, oh gosh, it's time to stop.
No, it's great. No, thank you very much.
I'll stop sharing. So, right, okay.
Yeah.